Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this group. As was mentioned, I work for the Food and Drug Administration, and we were asked to kind of outline our concerns regarding eggs and salmonella, and also to kind of sort of outline the public health basis for the egg safety regulations that we have ongoing at the center. And as Dr. Curtis mentioned, the primary concern with regard to eggs at FDA, well, in general in the poultry science, is Salmonella enteritidis, so that one specific serotype. But if you look at the Salmonella surveillance data in general from these two surveillance networks, specifically looking at FoodNet, in 2007, which is the latest data that I could find, there were 17,883 lab-confirmed cases. Of those 17,883, Salmonella in general accounted for about that accounted for the largest percentage of those lab-confirmed cases. And if we break that down further, Salmonella enteritidis accounted for the largest percentage within the Salmonellas at 16.9%. If we look at the latest Salmonella annual survey that's put out from CDC, and the latest one that I could find was from 2006, Salmonella enteritidis is the second most common type of serotype that's isolated from human sources. The incidence of SE declined from about 1995 to about 1999, so it declined in the late 1990s. But since around 1999, it sort of has remained relatively stable. Again, as I mentioned, when we're talking about eggs at FDA, we're really primarily concerned about Salmonella enteritidis. But as Dr. Curtis mentioned, we also keep an eye on other serotypes, and certainly Salmonella Heidelberg is sort of an up-and-coming, if you will, leg-associated salmonella. So that's something that I just wanted to mention, that it is on our radar screen. Anytime that you look at an outbreak and the vehicle is identified as eggs, very often the serotype that you're going to be dealing with is Salmonella enteritidis. There's a correlation between SE and eggs, and this is supported in the literature as well as in the outbreak and traceback investigations that we've done over the years. When we're talking about, as I said, one of the things that I was asked to do was sort of outline some of the egg safety activities that we have ongoing in eggs specifically. So the activities that we have ongoing are, of course, our safe handling requirements, our refrigeration requirements, and the primary egg safety activity, which is what I'll talk about the most today, is our final egg rule. So with regard to our labeling requirements, our refrigeration requirements, those were published in 2000 and they were effective in 2001. And basically the labeling requirements, that safe handling statement to be displayed on egg cartons, and you can see that at your local grocery store. And the refrigeration requirements basically state that eggs must be held at an ambient temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit or cooler at retail establishments. So again, one of the things that we were asked to do was to basically give you a public health basis for our regulations regarding eggs. So I thought that I'd give you a timeline on this final egg rule that we finalized, and it sort of will give you a good idea of what it was based on and how it came to be. In 1990, FDA reclassified eggs as a potentially hazardous food in the food code. In that same year, they provided guidance for proper refrigeration and cooking of eggs. In 1995, we amended our model food code to require the use of pasteurized eggs when you're dealing with highly susceptible populations, for example, very young or very old people where some of them may be immunocompromised. In that same year, we began conducting traceback investigations on implicated flocks. In 1997, in conjunction with USDA FSIS, we held some public meetings to discuss an SE risk assessment for eggs and egg products, and we also discussed the safety of foods during transportation and storage. That same year, jointly with USDA FSIS, FDA published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking designed to improve the safety of foods that included eggs during transportation and storage. And a food code section was created that year to emphasize the safety of eggs when you're dealing with highly susceptible populations. Again, as I mentioned, that safe handling statement and those refrigeration requirements were first proposed in 1999. Also in 1999, we added guidance on the food code dealing with pooled eggs. in that same year, way back in the Clinton administration, there was a document that was drafted that was called the Egg Safety Action Plan. And this Egg Safety Action Plan basically outlined systems and practices that needed to be put in place to minimize the incidence of salmonella in eggs. And from this document and also from the joint risk assessment that we conducted with FSIS, it was determined that a multiple intervention strategy was much better at attacking the salmonella problem in eggs than any single intervention strategy. So as I said earlier, in 2000, the FDA published the final rule requiring that safe handling of statements and also the refrigeration requirements, and of course they were implemented in 2001. Now in 2004, September, I believe 22nd of 2004, we published a proposed rule to prevent salmonella in shell eggs from becoming contaminated with SE. And in 2009, that proposed rule became final. So this final rule is, I would say, the primary egg safety activity that's ongoing at CFSAN with regard to salmonella. Now, when you're talking about regulation of eggs, you have to mention EQAP'S, as Dr. Curtis mentioned. That stands for Egg Quality Assurance Programs. And these are programs that are implemented at the state level. They've certainly been shown to be effective. However, they're voluntary. Not all states participate or have them. I think perhaps two of the most well-known ones are the Pennsylvania Egg Quality Assurance Program, as well as the California Egg Quality Assurance Program. They vary in their requirements, also in the way they're implemented and in the way they're enforced. So FDA's final rule, in a way, takes off where those egg quality assurance programs leave off, and it strives to set a national standard for egg safety. And it's important to note, before I go into detail on this egg rule, that it's one step in a broader farm-to-table safety effort, and that includes the safe handling statements, the refrigeration requirements, and also education of consumers and retail establishments. So exactly what does this new regulation say? As Dr. Curtis said, if this works in the poultry in the egg sector, I would anticipate that maybe you would see other industries would be affected. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on. But what exactly does the regulation say? And the first thing that we're always asked is who's affected by this new rule? And the answer to that is as follows. If a producer has more than 3,000 birds on their farm, more than 3,000 layers, they do not sell all of their eggs directly to the public, and any of their eggs are not treated, and I'll define treated in a minute, that producer is required to comply with all the requirements of the rule. A producer that has those same set of that same scenario, so he has 3,000 birds, he doesn't sell his eggs directly to consumers, however, he treats his eggs, then in that scenario, that producer is only required to comply with the refrigeration requirement. And there are also refrigeration requirements for transporters and storage facilities. So if you transport or hold eggs for shell egg processing or egg products facilities, then you have to refrigerate them. And that applies, of course, when eggs come from a farm that had 3,000 or more birds. So again, the definition of treatment becomes very important because it determines exactly what parameters of the rule you have to comply with. And treatment is defined as a technology or process that achieves at least a 5-log destruction of SC in the eggs or the processing of eggs in accordance with the Egg Products Inspection Act. The rule is composed of several different SE prevention measures, and these include the requirement to procure SE-monitored pullets, a biosecurity program, a rodent and pest control program, also cleaning and disinfection requirements. These only come into play when you have a positive environmental sample or when you have a positive egg sample, and also, of course, refrigeration requirements. So if we go into each of these specifically, your pullets must be SE monitored or raised under SE monitored conditions, and specifically that means that they must come from chicks that are procured from SE monitored breeder flocks that meet MPIP standards, and of course that stands for National Poultry Improvement Plan standards for U.S. Enteritidis clean status or equivalent. Now a producer is now required to test the environment that those pullets are raised at 14 to 16 weeks of age, so just before they come into egg production. If those tests are negative, then no additional testing is required until that group of hen reaches 40 to 45 weeks of age. If, however, that test is positive, that producer has to start testing his eggs within 2 weeks of that flock coming into egg production. And, of course, he must also clean his pullet environment by removing all visible manure, dry cleaning the house, and of course sanitizing it, disinfecting it using the appropriate disinfectants. Another requirement of the rule is the need to have a biosecurity program. And a biosecurity program is basically just a set of measures that's put in place to minimize the transfer of SC between houses. And at a minimum, the biosecurity program, according to this rule, must limit visitors on the farm and in the house. It has to protect against cross-contamination when either equipment or people are moved between houses. It must also prevent stray animals from entering the houses. And like many biosecurity programs in the poultry industry, it has to prevent employees from keeping birds at home. In addition to the biosecurity program, the rule now requires that producers have rodent and pest control programs. For your rodent control program, the producer must monitor for rodent activity by a visual inspection, either using mechanical traps, glue boards, or other appropriate monitoring methods. If those monitoring methods reveal that his rodent activity is unacceptable, then he must make changes to his SE prevention plan, to his rodent control program, and get that activity down to an acceptable level. Now, when we're talking about pest control, we're really talking about flies. So the producer is required to monitor for flies by spot cards, scudder grills, sticky traps, or other appropriate methods. And just like the rodent control program, if you find that your fly activity is unacceptable, you have to make adjustments or modifications, take corrective actions to your fly control program and get that level down to acceptable level. And of course, one of the first questions that we're asked is what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And that's something that's going to be addressed in guidance that's going to be published. In fact, it's already in the clearance process. As part of your rodent and pest control program, another thing that the producer is required to do is remove debris within the house, and also around the perimeter of the house, remove any vegetation or debris that could provide harborage for pests or rodents. As I mentioned, there are cleaning and disinfection requirements that are a part of this rule. And these, again, it's important to note, will only come into play when you have a positive environmental sample or when you have a positive egg sample. And basically, it just says that you have to remove all visible manure, you have to dry clean the house, and then disinfect it using appropriate disinfectants. Now, refrigeration requirements are a big part of this rule, and certainly something that we received a ton of questions on. And basically, once an egg is laid, if it's after 36 hours after being laid, it has to be refrigerated at a temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. And this is, of course, because refrigeration has been shown to minimize the growth of SE in eggs. And, of course, this applies only, this is the one requirement of the rule that applies to all eggs, regardless of whether they were subjected to a treatment or not, such as pasteurization. As I mentioned, there are also refrigeration requirements now during transport and storage. So, and again, they have to be held when they're being transported at 45 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Now, there's also a tempering step that's allowed. So in a scenario, let's say that an egg was laid, it's 36 hours later, so then by the letter of the law of the rule, that egg has to be refrigerated, and then that producer's later on going to process it. He's allowed to temper it at room temperature for an additional 36 hours, and this accounts for thermal checks. Now, the testing requirements are another big part of the rule. When you're talking about testing requirements in the context of this final rule, we're talking about testing the environment as well as testing the eggs. And testing is basically a barometer of how well your SE prevention plan is working. So if we look first at environmental testing, in addition to that test that's required when just before those pullets come into production, anytime a group of hens in a house reaches an age of 40 to 45 weeks of age, that environment has to be tested. And if that flock is molted, then there's an additional test that's required at 4 to 6 weeks after the molt. If that test is positive, then you have to review and make adjustments to your SE prevention plan. And then the producer has to either make a choice. He's going to divert those eggs from that farm to a treatment such as pasteurization for the life of the flock, or he's going to begin egg testing. And if he begins egg testing, he has to have results from those tests within 10 calendar days. And this is, obviously it's been brought to our attention that 10 calendar days may not be feasible, and that's something that, again, will be addressed in guidance. When you're talking about egg testing, and again, this only comes into play when you have a positive environmental sample. So you had a positive environmental sample at 40 to 45 weeks of age. Then you have to begin testing of eggs. That producer has to conduct 4 consecutive tests at 2-week intervals, and each test has to consist of 1,000 intact shell eggs that are representative of that day's production. If all those tests are negative, then no further testing is required. If any of those tests are positive, then he must start to divert those eggs to pasteurization, and then if he's able to get 4 negative consecutive egg tests at 2-week intervals, he's able to come back into production. So in a scenario where a producer had a positive environmental sample, so he had to start testing his eggs, he then had a positive egg test. So then in the meantime, he was diverting his eggs, but then he made adjustments to his SE prevention plan, and he was able to obtain those 4 consecutive negative egg tests at 2-week intervals. Then in that scenario, that producer still has to conduct 1 monthly test for the life of that flock. Again, 1,000 shell eggs, representative of a day's production. So pretty extensive testing that's required. There are also, FDA recognizes that there are different styles of houses in different regions of the country. So your sampling plan must be appropriate to the style of the house that you use. The official method that's incorporated by reference into the rule is a drag swab method, but other sampling methods will be addressed in guidance. The testing methodology for the environment, that's the title of it, that can be found online. And the testing methodology for the eggs is basically Chapter 5 of FDA's BAM manual, or Bacteriological Analytical Manual. There are also administrative requirements in this rule, and those state that at each farm you must have 1 or more individuals responsible for administration of the SE prevention plan. That individual must either complete training or he must have sufficient job experience that he's qualified to manage the SE prevention plan. And his responsibilities are basically to develop and implement the SE prevention plan, to reassess it in the event that, for example, he finds a positive environmental sample. He has to make adjustments to that SE prevention plan so he can come back into compliance. And also, of course, review records. And on the subject of records, there are some pretty extensive record-keeping requirements as a part of this regulation. Of course, the first requirement is that you have to have a written SE prevention plan on the farm. You also have to have documentation that your pullets were SE monitored or raised under SE monitored conditions. You have to have records anytime that you make a modification or you take a corrective action to your SE prevention plan. You have to keep records for all those SE prevention measures that I mentioned. For examples include for your biosecurity plan, you might keep log sheets or inspection or reports on your boot dipping stations. For your rodent and pest control programs, you might keep records showing when you did those inspections, what you found during those inspections, and any corrective actions that you took. In the case that you had a positive environment or a positive egg sample and you had to begin egg testing, you should keep records of the sanitizing agents or disinfectants that you used, when you used them. Refrigeration requirements, you might keep temperature logs, temperature recorder charts. Anytime that you do test your environment and test the eggs, of course, you have to keep a record of the procedure that you used or the protocol that you used and any findings that you had. And when you divert eggs, you should note when, where they were sent. Those records must include the name of the producer and the location of the farm, the date that activity was done, and also the signature of the person that entered that record. There's some general record-keeping requirements. The data and information on that record should be entered at the time that you did that activity rather than waiting a couple of hours or even a couple of days. And, of course, it stands to reason, but you should record the actual values that you saw instead of make data up. The records must be maintained for at least a year after the flock is taken permanently out of production. And except for your written SE prevention plan, which has to be on-site, you can keep records off-site as long as you can access them within 24 hours if a request for them is made. And if you keep records electronically, they're considered to be on-site if you can access them from a computer on-site. There are refrigeration requirements as part of this rule. Those requirements dictate that a producer has to register within 30 days of becoming an egg producer. In the case of current producers, he must register by the applicable compliance date, and I'll touch on those compliance dates in just a minute. Of course, the preferred method to register is electronically, but you can also do so by mail or fax or CD-ROM if you have multiple submissions. Now, the compliance for this particular rule is set up in a staggered fashion where larger producers have to come into compliance first. So if a producer has greater than 50,000 birds or more, he has to be in compliance by July 9th of this year, so in a couple of months. If he's a smaller producer, say he has between 3,000 and 49,999 layers, he has until July 9th of 2012 to come into compliance. And in a case where a person just transports eggs or stores them, that person has to comply with the refrigeration requirements by July 9th of this year. So obviously, as I mentioned, and I went into great detail, this is the primary egg safety activity with regard to eggs and salmonella that we have ongoing at CFSAN. And it's also generated a lot of extra things that we have to work on in conjunction with this rule, or the rule created a lot of extra work, and that includes guidance that we have to publish, and that's currently being developed. In fact, there's a draft already made up. It's in the clearance process. Per good government practices, this guidance will be published as draft, and it'll be open for public comment. In enforcing this rule, FDA plans to contract out with some of the states. So we're also working on guidance for the states to work with FDA on those contracts to do those inspections. And we're also developing a compliance policy guide. And a compliance policy guide is essentially a how-to manual for our field staff on how to conduct those egg inspections. And we're also working on a training module to train our field staff and also any state regulators that are going to contract with FDA. I anticipate for the first couple of training sessions, it'll be mostly FDA staff and state staff, but as space permits, industry will certainly be invited to participate in that training. So in conclusion, as I mentioned, the egg safety rule is the primary egg safety activity that we have ongoing at CFSAN. And I'm talking specifically with eggs. Obviously, our produce department, they deal with a lot of different kinds of issues. But our hope is that FDA expects that this final rule will significantly decrease the number of SE-contaminated eggs and ultimately decrease the number of egg-associated illnesses with regards to SE.